Do you believe investing is simple, or do you believe that investing is complicated?
The trick in this is that don't try to optimize. Don't try to be the best investor who unearths the biggest multi-baggers. How much in equity, how much in fixed income, how much in gold, how much in silver, how much in real estate. That's going to determine 85 to 90% of your return.
Imagine you were 25, right, and just starting out, and you had rupees 10,000 to invest via SIP.
So it doesn't matter. You don't have to save 20% of your salary. Save 5%, 7%, 10%, whatever. But when you get the increment, save 70% of that. So that's the trick. Because when you're young, you should also max out your PPF, for example, Public Provident Fund, because that's a good place to be in. So that's definitely a place you should invest in.
I just want you to throw light on this whole conception or misconception of chasing multi-baggers.
No fund manager, no investor has had a track record of let alone 100% multi-baggers, even 50% multi-baggers. In Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger said that if you take out our 10 or 12 best performers, our performance would be much below average.
Why do institutions actually go on and invest in these expensive IPOs? What's the reason?
When people say don't be so honest about it and let out this secret, but I've been an investment banker also. So often also an arrangement that fine, there are certain in IPOs where the funds are keen to invest, but if you want decent allotment there, then here also you must put in some money. I mean, some of the monies that have been put with by the mutual fund have been like so small, 0.001% of their assets, that it matters nothing to them.
Hello and welcome to the Beyond Returns podcast by ET Money. Today we are joined by Devina Mehra. She is the founder and CMD of First Global, and I'm sure many of you already know who she is. Now, Devina ma'am has been an achiever since her early years. While doing her graduation at Lucknow University, she won 8 gold medals. She's also gold medalist from IIM Ahmedabad, and her research skills are well known even beyond India. So much so that Jeff Bezos once wrote her a thank you email when she went against the popular opinion of Wall Street to give a buy rating on Amazon. Now, her list of achievement is far too long to be discussed here. But one great thing about Devina ma'am is that she speaks her mind openly, freely, and in all honesty. And in this podcast, we are going to talk about a variety of subjects that are going to help you in your investment journey. Ma'am, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the podcast. Now, ma'am, the budget is behind us, but I read an interesting column that you had written before the budget, where I think you were the only one who specifically said that you're not expecting anything much out of this budget for certain reasons. Now, can you explain to listeners why you were not expecting much? And secondly, there was a very sharp observation about STT in your column, right? I just wanted to know, do you think that's the reason why we've also seen the STT rate go up? So just you can give the context about what you wrote, why you wrote it.
Perfect. So I'm a data-driven person. So I was just going by the data. So I had looked at the tax revenue numbers were available up to January 11th. So from 1st of April 2025 to 11th of January 2026. And what I saw was that the tax collections were running way below budgeted numbers. And this time, I think the government also tried its best not to give refunds. Even then, the net tax revenues was running at about 8% growth as against a budget of 11% growth. And part of the reason was that the nominal GDP growth has been very low. And of course, last year, even at the budget time, my commentary was that at that time, nominal GDP growth was supposed to be in the 10 plus range. And both GST and corporate tax were budgeted to grow by 10.5%, 10.7%, something like that, which was in line with nominal GDP growth. Now we are at a nominal GDP growth of only 8 plus, which is against 12% average for the last 20 years. So big shortfall. And nominal GDP corporate profits are all tied to the tax collections and the corporate profits are all tied to the nominal GDP, not the real GDP, which makes the headlines. So that was clear. And also last year, there was something very strange in the budget, which was that personal income tax rates were cut. But still, the government was budgeting actually a 14.5% increase in personal income tax. And I had written then itself that the government is just banking on the capital market and the speculation in the capital market. And STT was supposed to grow by 40%. So I said, like, the regulator is trying to cut speculation, but the government is literally banking on it. So I think this time they would have decided that anyway, it's a good thing to cut speculation. So may as well at least increase the rates. So to whatever extent this goes on, we would cut the rates and we would increase the rates and therefore hopefully get some revenue out of it. And this year, of course, the revenue estimates are, the growth rates are really low. So, I mean, the government isn't expecting that much of revenue growth this year. So, I mean, you can't just, talk of stories and narratives and this is what we want from the finance minister without looking at the numbers. So, that was pretty much a reality check and that's how it panned out.
Really? So that was actually a sharp observation about STT also. It's only because I read your column, I probably went on those lines thinking that maybe that's the reason behind hiking the STT rates also. Now, ma'am, from broader questions, I want to
I mean,
talk
I had
about
written a
market.
column a few months ago on this whole derivative speculation and saying that too many people on the gravy train. It is not just the stockbrokers. The government gets money. Even SEBI gets something. The stock exchanges, that's a big part of the volume. And it is way out of line with anywhere near the derivative volume in any country in the world. In any country in the world, the market cap to derivative ratio is nowhere close to where we are. And that's a bit of a, conflict of interest, if you may say that, because stock exchanges are the first level regulators. But if they are listed or nearly listed, there is profit pressure. So how do you balance that with that quarterly profit pressure and a desire to curb unnatural levels of speculation?
If I have to ask you whether the markets are undervalued, fairly valued, or overvalued, what would be your answer? I mean, you can take any metric as per your wish, be it PB, be it market cap to GDP or BA ratio. What's your view on the overall broader markets?
Actually, these crude level valuation metrics don't really work, and especially at the index level, if you're looking at price to earning, the price to book. Remember, the index itself has changed so much over the years. If you look at the original Sensex list, it was textiles, paper, shipping, Premier Automobiles, Hindustan Motors, Mafatlal, JK, Singhania, the Thappers, those groups. But now it's a completely different list. 25 years ago, there were no banks in the main indices. Now banks and lenders are the biggest chunk of biggest weightage in the indexes. At one time, PSUs dominated the Sensex and Nifty, and then in between, for a good 15 years, people forgot that PSUs are listed and can be invested in. So it all changes. But if you look at sectoral PEs to whatever extent, I mean, PE itself is a fairly crude measure, but to whatever extent you can look at that, we are not at extremes. In most cases, we are not even above averages if you look at sectoral PE over a couple of decades. So we are not at extremes. So which is why I don't think there's a danger of a big crash, which is why my general recommendation is do not have 100% of your portfolio in equity, but whatever is your equity allocation, remain invested, because that way you don't miss out on the big moves. And it is when you are anxious and fearful and asking this question that should I remain invested, should I stop my SIPs, most of the time that's the best time to remain invested. We had looked at about 45 years of data, and he said, suppose you miss out on the 10 best days in the market. And what happens? Then you would think in 40 odd years, what is 10 days? But you miss out on 2/3 of the return. So if your 100 rupees had become 85,000 instead of 85,000, you're now at 27,000. And if you miss out on 30 best days, you've given up 90% of the return. So most of the time, therefore, makes sense to remain invested. And these sharp moves come when general sentiment is down. They don't come in the middle of a bull market. In a bull market, the moves are not so sudden and sharp. The only exception was the Harshad Mehta bull market, because that was a rigged market. That was the only time you had sharp up moves, I think on 1 or 2 days, which were comparable to these kind of moves. So that is the thing. So, it is when your mind is screaming that don't be in the market is when you should be in the market. When you are very happy and think the returns are there for the taking is when you should be cautious, which was most of 2024.
Very true, ma'am. Now, ma'am, you've been part of the market in one role or the other, right? Over the past more than 3 decades. I just wanted to understand what's your views. Do you believe investing is simple, or do you believe that investing is complicated?
I think investing is neither as simple nor as complicated as people make it out to be. So the trick in this is that don't try to optimize. Don't try to be the best investor who unearths the biggest multi-baggers. I say that good investing is boring. So and I am afraid that, and this has been my long-held belief, that a good number of people are in the equity markets for the entertainment value. That and if I don't invest myself, what am I going to talk about at parties and on WhatsApp groups and all that? But that's not the purpose of investing. So do the sensible things right, which is asset allocation. So how much in equity, how much in fixed income, how much in gold, how much in silver, how much in real estate. That's going to determine 85 to 90% of your returns. It is not trying to unearth the biggest stock picks. And that is the part, that's why it is, just a lot of people just freeze and say that when I understand, I will start, and years just go by. So don't do that. So be sensible, and don't, within equities, don't try to time the themes and which sector, and just be in the broad-based multi-cap, flexi-cap kind of funds, and some lower risk fixed income assets, some gold, silver, which should be maybe, less than 10% of your allocation. And that's the sensible thing to do. So and one thing which is usually missing in most Indians' portfolios, global diversification. So asset allocation doesn't mean just asset allocation within India. India is only 5% of the world market cap. So why should your 85 or 90 or 100% of your investment be here? So, and I have one statistic I always give: when I started working, the dollar was 12 rupees. So in the course of less than a career, you had a 90% appreciation. When people are investing, they're investing towards some financial goals, which are typically, 20, 30 years away. So how can you forget this, that the rupee depreciates in this fashion? So get the broad things right, and that is good enough. I mean, good investing is boring. People tell me that you repeat the same advice. I said, good investing advice doesn't change every 2 weeks or 2 months even. It is what it is.
Ma'am, that's true. But if I look at all over social media, right, people even struggle with basic things such as asset allocation and where should they be investing, how should they be rebalancing. You have people debating about a lot of things, even for the simple things. So my next question is about that. The trend of DIY investing is on the rise in India, right? So I just wanted to understand that, do you think people should spend time managing their own investments, or is it best to leave it to professional? Now, let's say if somebody decides that they want to manage their own investment, right? How do they realize whether they are doing a better job than a fund manager or an investment advisor?
Okay, so first of all, the two parts to your question. One, you said on people don't know how to do asset allocation. So let me tell you the two biggest bad pieces of advice on asset allocation. One is that be 100% in equity if you are young. So sometimes, people tell me I'm 25, I'm in a good job, so should I be 100% in equity? No, you should not be 100% in equity. Equity should be money you don't need, or any possibility of needing it within the next 7 to 10 years at least. So even if you're in a good job, you might lose your job, you might want to study further, you might want to buy a house, if there might be a medical emergency. So certain portion of your money should not be in equity. And the other side, equally bad advice is that when you retire, you should be 100% in fixed income. Now, if you're retiring at 60, your life expectancy can be 30 or 35 years. It's a long time to budget for. You don't want to run out of money at 81 and find that you're still alive at 95. So therefore, even when you retire, you should have a significant portion in equity. Of course, as I said, whatever you need to withdraw over the next 5, 7 years, you should not be in equity, because equity money, if you withdraw, then what happens is that if the bad years in equity markets, and there will always be bad years in equity markets, come early, then, and you are withdrawing, you're actually withdrawing out of your capital, and then your money wouldn't, might run out in 15 years instead of 25. So that's the one thing to be careful on, that you're not withdrawing from equity money. So therefore, certain amount has to be a fixed income. As far as managing your own money, particularly equity money, is concerned, as I said, a lot of people do it for entertainment. The way to do it is, suppose you are considering investing in, 5 different equity funds or PMSs, and treat yourself as the sixth fund manager, and not just look at all the good calls of yours that you remember, but go through your DP statement, look at everything you have done, and look at how the returns were, what the losses, interim losses were, what the volatility was, and just the way you are evaluating every other fund manager, and see whether you are the best fund manager there is. I suspect you would not be in most cases. For people who have a day job or a day business, that may not be the case. So it is better to give the bulk of your money, for most people this holds true, to professionals. And as I said, if you either want to learn or you want to be involved in the market, keep maybe 10-20% for yourself as play money.
Got it. Got it. Ma'am, in fact, on that specific answer, then does it make sense for somebody who may not have the right time and still want to do DIY to look at index funds instead of, let's say, active or, so two parts here, right? So look at index funds if they are mutual fund investors, and if they're stock investors, then maybe look at mutual funds. In one case, you have markets automatically taking care of your returns, and in the second case, there's a professional managing your money. So does it make sense in these two scenarios?
See, one thing, remember, one is that index fund is not some number, index is not something that the heavens are giving you. That also is someone making a decision on what goes into the index or not. The other thing is that people think that index fund is somehow less risky or safer. But actually, the real value that a fund manager adds is risk management. So an active strategy is supposed to protect your capital better than a passive strategy, that if the market tanks 25-30%, your portfolio doesn't tank 25-30%. That's what an active fund manager is supposed to add, which is why I say, sometimes people say that how do I evaluate a fund manager? I said, besides the past data, the point is that every fund manager will have a lovely presentation on how they pick stocks that they invest in. So ask them when they sell, what's the selling strategy? What is the risk management strategy? And then you will know how much in depth have they thought about these things. And that's really critical. And I think that came through in a ET Money analysis of mutual funds also, which was that it came out that the best performing mutual fund schemes were the ones that outperformed during downturns. I think there was one scheme which outperformed 93% of the up moves, but it was in the bottom 5 schemes because it fell more when the markets fell. So that is actually comes out in real life Indian data as well.
True, true. Ma'am, in fact, I've come across a lot of social media posts where people put in a lot of data, and they say that if you stay invested in small and mid cap funds for a very long term horizon, right, you can make really high returns. Now, I just wanted to understand that, let's say if someone has a very long term horizon, can they actually have a very high exposure to mid and small cap funds? Does that work?
Okay, let me first tell you some data from the US market. So US also, when people did it at a broad, so there's a couple of things to this. So one is this, that when they did it at a broad level, it appeared that the small cap mutual funds had outperformed overall mutual funds. This I'm talking the US. but then they adjusted for survivorship bias. So all the schemes that went out of business or which had to be merged with something else because they were doing badly, once you added all of that, there was no outperformance. So that's number one. So, this is called survivorship bias, that you're looking at only the survivors and the success. And it's not just true of mutual funds, it's true of stocks also. I'll give you an example later by later. But so you are only looking backwards at all the funds that have actually done well. That's essentially what you're doing. And also the level of volatility is not imaginable in cold blood. So, and this is an example I've been giving, not just, I mean, not an example, this is the data I've been giving not just now, but during the small cap boom in 2024, which is that in 2008-9, the small cap index at the index level fell almost 80%, 78% to be exact. And remember, when something falls 80%, it has to go up 5 times to be at zero. So it took 8 years for it to come back to the 2008 level. It came back in 2016. And that's also theoretical because this index churns 80 to 20% every year. So 8 years later, almost no stock that was there in 2008 would be there. So that is one. And then there was a mad bull run in 2018-19. And after that, again, there was a 2/3 fall, but 65% fall. And you can say that I can pick and choose the stocks well, but how many stocks did not fall in the 2008-9 fall? 1%. In the 19 fall, only 8%. So you're not a genius who will find these stocks. So, I mean, this is a risky area of the market. And in cold blood, people think that, yes, I will live through the volatility. SEBI data shows that on the average, no mutual fund investor remains invested for even 2 years. The majority leave a scheme within 2 years. That's the data. I mean, recently a mutual fund, I think, completed some 25 years. And they looked at the data, said only 23 people have remained invested from beginning to the end. So all this, compounding that you see, actually people's portfolios don't see, because, once it is easy to say, yes, I'll live through the volatility, but, let's see you live through the volatility when something falls 80%. So nobody actually does that. And so be careful on these are risky areas of the market, which is not to say you should never invest, but should not be a very large portion of your investment. Mid cap, see, now actually SEBI is no longer looking at small cap, mid cap as this much market cap. So actually the mid cap cutoff is quite high in terms of market cap. So mid caps are almost, large size if you look at from the market cap point of view, because now SEBI does this top 100 stocks, next to 50 like that instead of the market cap cutoff. So those will have their own dynamics, and which is sectoral also. And also this last 5-year, 10-year depends on when you start. If you are started before the 23-24 boom and look backwards, the numbers would have looked very different. So I know of small cap fund managers and, not necessarily mutual funds, but, PMS and all that, who's in the 2019 fall, they lost something like 90%. And therefore, you can say that I've compounded 50% for 3 years, but again, don't forget your school maths. If you fall 80% and compound 50% for 3 years, you're still below par.
Ma'am, I'm going to ask you a very simplistic question, but this is just to give a viewers an idea about what we spoke. So it's like bringing it all together, right? So let's imagine you were 25, right, and just starting out, and you had rupees 10,000 to invest via SIP. So mota, how would you invest this 10,000 rupees across whatever funds or segments?
Okay, first of all, this is a little different from your question. First of all, if you're young, start investing. So you will see all the calculations which show that if you start saving and investing a certain amount every month when you are 25, you will have X amount at 60. But if you start investing only at 30, you will have to save almost double that amount. So start. And sometimes people say that I don't earn that much. So it doesn't matter. You don't have to save 20% of your salary. Save 5%, 7%, 10%, whatever. But when you get the increment, save 70% of that. So that's the trick. In terms of where to invest, again, see, everybody's circumstances are not the same. As I said, some people want to work for 2 years and then maybe study for a while. So you will budget differently, whether your parents are financially independent or you have to give some money there. So that also will determine it. But of course, when you are younger, you can have a far greater equity allocation. So, you can have maybe a 70% equity allocation or 75%. But the balance should be in other assets, fixed income. And fixed income, make sure that you are not in high risk fixed income. The whole point of fixed income is that you should be uh, that should be lowering your volatility. So don't buy something like, let's say, a credit mutual fund or something, because that's not what you want. So it's fixed deposits. Of course, when you're young, you should also max out your PPF, for example, public provident fund, because that's a good place to be in. So that's definitely a place you should invest in. So that's so do that, and then only after you max that out should you look at other fixed income instruments. So that is broadly what you should be doing. Not 100% in equity, but yes, a high percentage in equity at that stage.
Right, right. Ma'am, in fact, there's one data point that you have put out which is really, really fascinating. So, this is about how often Warren Buffett sells his investments, right? Now, I'm bringing this up because I've seen people, they think that if they put in enough efforts, right, they will be able to find multi baggers. Now, I just want you to throw some light on this whole thing about chasing multi baggers, and also if you can talk about the data point relating to Warren Buffett.
Okay, so this is just data. I mean, I'm a data person. So, like people say that he doesn't sell. So, let's look at what. So somebody had done a study on his investments, and they found that he sells 85% of what he buys within 2 years, 50% within 6 months itself. So that's nothing wrong with it, except that, people's impression is something different. And which also tells you that you may be the greatest investor, you might be the greatest fund manager. Nobody knows the future. Investing is a game of luck and skill. It is a game of probabilities, because you don't know the future. And if after living through 2020, people don't realize that you don't know the future. I mean, you obviously didn't know that something like a pandemic was coming. But suppose I had told you at the beginning of 2020 that something will come which will disrupt the world to an extent that revenues of whole sectors will go to zero. Aviation, automobile, hotels, retail. Would you have ever said that there would be a bull market? So life is that uncertain. I mean, in hindsight, we can always find nice little reasons that yes, liquidity was injected, governments gave money to. But I mean, I'm sure in sitting, if I had at the beginning of 2020, if I had told you that something of this disruption was coming, you would have said that the markets would be wiped out. So that's the nature of the beast. So you cannot know in advance, and therefore anyone who tells you that they have this magic formula of finding which are the multi-baggers is fooling you, maybe also fooling themselves for all I care, but they are definitely fooling you, because no fund manager, no investor has had a track record of, let alone 100% multi-baggers, even 50% multi-baggers. In Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger said that if you take out our 10 or 12 best performers, our performance would be much below average. But they didn't know in advance that which are those 10 stocks. Otherwise, they would have bought only those 10 stocks. And so also with everyone, with Rakesh Jhunjhunwala, every time you would meet Rakesh, he would be talking up a different stock. He also didn't know that I'll make all my money in Titan, CRISIL, Lupin, and one or two others. So nobody knows in advance. So the only way to do this is that with some sensible system, you buy at least 25, 30 stocks, which is, something that, I mean, our EMS has little more, but our small case, which is the recommended basket, has about that many. And even then, you should be prepared for the fact that at least 5, 7 of them will not perform at all. The balanced majority might give normal returns. And maybe if you've chosen well and you are lucky, you might get 2 or 3 multi-baggers, which is what I tell people when people say, oh, you found HDFC Bank in 1996 and you found Amazon at 2001, which is today's Amazon or HDFC Bank, and that I can buy and forget for my child for 20 years. I said, no one has this magic word. Always look at what you started out from, which is the same thing when people say buy and forget blue chips. I said, look at the definition of blue chips, how that has evolved. And if you had been holding the original Sensex blue chips, what would have happened to you? So, that's the thing. And those were not like fly by night companies. Those were all companies with decades of history. I mean, if you look at the original Sensex list, 29 out of the 30 companies were really old established companies. There was only one relatively new company, Indian Hotel. That's it. So, but you will remember that somebody's grandparents had Hindustan Lever and this is the return. You will forget that they also had Premier Automobiles or,
Ma'am, in fact, this was something I wanted to ask you. So we have read about stories, right, about communities in Mumbai which used to gift their daughters shares of Hindustan Unilever when the daughters would get married in late 80s and 90s, right? So I just wanted to ask you, this whole coffee can investing, does it work or is it all about luck?
it is all about, as I said, survivorship bias. So you're talking about the stocks that made you the returns. That's what the examples I gave you. So it's not as if that nothing gave you return. Yes, but at that time there were several other stocks which would have been in the same category, which you may as well have bought. And how random some of these things are. I spoke about, Rakesh making a lot of money in Titan. That was his number one winner. I recently read a book by Titan CEO called The Tanish Story. And the big takeaway in that book was that how many times that business came close to being shut down, the jewelry business. At least 3 times it came to a position where it was almost shut down. Sometimes because of big strategic blunders they make, sometimes it's because of regulatory changes. And it was just that the Tata said, okay, watch it for another 6 months, 1 year, and it went through. So let alone an outsider, no company insider also knows the 20-year trajectory of any company. Aditya Puri wouldn't have known that HDFC Bank would turn out to be the only company in the listed universe that would give a profit increase every year for 20 years only. I didn't know it. Aditya Puri didn't know it. Jeff Bezos did not know that, he may have slipped, but at least he got to the richest man in the world. So that is the part which no one knows. So in hindsight, it is very easy to build the story. In everything, Apple also, what is the one-line story everyone knows? That Steve Jobs came and he has this great vision and he turned around Apple. But what is the data? That even after he came back, for 7 years, not 1 or 2, 7 years, Apple did nothing. Every year it would make either a marginal loss or a marginal profit. Then iPod was a hit. And then suddenly, the story changed. So it is always very illuminating to read the actual story of companies, and you will find that it's very different from the one-line story I mean, Nike was around since the 70s, and it is this marketing juggernaut now. But the founder was actually quite anti-marketing. He thought this was like some woolly thing. He was an accountant. And now, you have a totally different vision of what Nike is. So it's always, read. So you will come to know what the real stories are and be ready to examine the data rather than just swallow the narratives.
Ma'am, in fact, I have two questions. So I think I'll ask you the first one. Do you actually believe that it is difficult to understand that a company may, like the stock price may grow 300 or 400%? Because like we all know, when you wrote a report on HDFC, right, you portrayed it as a baby and then growing up to become a Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? Now that shows that you were expecting it to become at least 400, 500 times. That's what the transition showed. So is it not possible for analysts, people to at least understand that this is the kind of potential the company has?
Normally, what you can at the most foresee is maybe a doubling or tripling of the stock price most of the time. And then you have to kind of reevaluate. And, this was a completely a shake-up in the industry. So this was before that, almost 100% of the share was with PSU banks. And then, this company is coming, which has a good credentials and a good brand name. And so you think that, yes, private sector banks will take away some share, and especially this company. And if you remember, HDFC Bank was not a retail company to start with. It was a corporate bank. And I have been a corporate banker, and I knew it was very difficult to break into good companies consortium. And there they had a kind of unfair advantage of the brand name and the contacts of HDFC itself, which actually opened a lot of doors for them. So that also was there. But you again have to, as I said, look at the numbers. So as an aside, while people remember our HDFC Bank call, what they don't remember is that we were the only firm to have a negative view on HDFC, the parent, in the late 90s. And HDFC, to give you some context, was the number one loved stocks by the foreign institutional investor. There was no stock that was loved more. So at that time, the FII limit used to, I think we started with 25% and then it was increased. So every time the limit would increase, HDFC's limit would be over the same day. There was so many people waiting to buy, so many institutions. And yet we wrote a negative report and people said, how can you write a negative report on a company which has, so many people waiting to buy? I said, the numbers are what they are. So nothing wrong with the management. But because there was so much demand, actually, they were raising money too frequently. They were raising money at that stage every year, and the returns were diluting. And at that time, hardly anybody looked at return on equity. But we said, the market cannot defy the numbers. And that's what happened. So for 5 years, the price didn't move. So there was a time correction of 5 years in that stock. So you have to look at, you have to be objective. But as I said, normally the trajectory, is not that long. And banking, I'm always a nervous investor. So in the case of HDFC Bank, let's say it was not just a numbers call. Amazon was a pure numbers call. HDFC Bank was also because, Aditya Puri downwards, so most of the bank was staffed by ex-City bankers. So they were ex-colleagues of mine. So I knew them and I took a bet on them because in banking, the big thing is that where are the negative surprises hiding? And that's as an outsider, there is no way to assess that. And in HDFC Bank's case, the risk head was my last boss in Cities, and I knew he was a conservative guy. So I said, at least, the risk part is in good hands. They're not going to do too many stupid things, and which turned out to be a good call. They actually did sidestep, for example, that big infrastructure funding group. But as I said, that was additional information. Amazon was a pure cash flow based call that the cash flows have turned around and which Wall Street was not looking at. I mean, Wall Street from being very positive Amazon had become 100% negative Amazon. Just at the time when the cash flows had turned around. So much so that we had not just a buy, we had a strong buy at a time when there was no other buy from Wall Street. And Jeff Bezos actually sent an email saying, thanks for the support, because ours was the only buy. So, but as I said, it's just a matter of objectively looking at data.
Okay. Now, ma'am, I want to touch upon IPOs because this has been a hot topic over the past 2 years, right? So I have two questions here. First is, I want to understand that if I'm an IPO investor and I see big marquee names, well-known institution, mutual funds investing in an IPO, should I follow them? Because that's where the smart money is going, right? And my second question is, why do mutual funds invest in expensive IPOs where valuations are stretched? What's the reason? And because you've been an investment banker yourself, I want you to throw some light on it.
Okay, so first of all, remember as an investor, there are no two ways of valuing a company. It is not as if that a listed company is valued one way and a company going for IPO is valued another way. There's only one way to value a company. So anytime anybody is telling you that let's look at these innovative or different valuation parameters, they're not telling you to do an valuation. They're telling you to do justify a valuation. So most of the time when there is an IPO frenzy, it almost never makes sense to try for an IPO because what happens is that most IPOs will be overpriced. And the ones that are not overpriced, sensible business, sensible valuation, you are unlikely to get allotment. So it doesn't make really any objective sense to play that game. See, first of all, now, even in IPOs, a lot of it is offer for sale. So a lot of the institutions that have bought before are exiting at the price at which you are buying. Remember that. So there might be a big VC or PE fund. And most IPOs are offered at 2 to 4 times the last fundraise. So they have made their money. You are still to make your money. And as far as mutual funds are concerned, in certain cases, I mean, people say don't be so honest about it and let out these secrets. But I've been an investment banker also, so anchor investors or the institutional part uh, of the IPO is not a lottery like the retail part. So there's discretion on part of the investors. So there's often also an arrangement that fine, there are certain IPOs where the funds are keen to invest. So they will say if you want decent, I mean, it might be said or unsaid, but if you want decent allotment there, then here also you must put in some money. I mean, some of the monies that have been put with by the mutual fund have been like so small, 0.001% of their assets, that it matters nothing to them. But for the retail investor, it's kind of a seal of approval that so and so mutual fund has bought. So it's like uh, I think it's a borderline not very good practice to have that, but that's the way the markets are, and that's the way. And remember that how well a stock does, how much demand there is in an IPO has nothing at all to do with how it will do in the aftermarket. So 2/3 of the stocks ever listed in India, probably a little more than that, are not even traded now. SEBI data shows that most retail investors just flip out, especially if the IPO lists at a premium. Everybody is out in 2 weeks' time. So you think it's a lottery game, but don't play fast and lose with your money, because some things you will be left holding the can. And if you look at the 2021 was when all these so-called new age tech companies came, and most of them didn't turn out to be that great an investment for investors. Also because many times the financials peak just before the IPO. This is also a pattern you see.
In fact, I've read you mentioned this in a column that if an IPO does well after listing, right, it is considered as a failure on the part of investment banker.
Yeah, I mean, that's literally the definition of an investment. What the investment banker's mandate is to maximize the price that the company and now increasingly the promoters or earlier investors are getting. So that's literally what they are supposed to do. So if they've left too much at the table and the price actually goes up thereafter, it is literally a failure that they left so much on the table that could have been got by the company or the promoters.
One important thing I do want to talk to you about is risk management, right? Now, I just want you to give viewers maybe some frameworks that they can use to manage risk when they invest. It can be either for general investors who invest in mutual fund and across, or specific to stock, whichever you prefer, ma'am.
Okay, first of all, one general thing, don't be at either end of the risk spectrum, which is something where I think I started with. But a lot of people save, but do not invest with any kind of intentionality. So what happens is that I was doing a podcast for a public sector company, and they said we have a lot of people who reach almost retirement age and who are still only in fixed deposit and provident fund, because they thought this is too complex. When I understand, then I'll start. So don't do that, because if you invest 1 lakh a year for 30 years in, let's say, banks at 5-6%, you will end up with 75 lakhs. If you do some kind of not very high risk asset allocation and compounding maybe 9%, you will end up with 1.6, 1.7 crore. If you do little more equity orientation, 12.5% compounding, you will end up with 3 crore. So 75 lakhs and 3 crores, that's the 4 times the difference. So be cognizant that you must have a sensible asset allocation from the beginning and not be. On the other hand, I see too many people thinking they will become day traders in stocks, in derivatives, in crypto. So don't do that either. That's playing fast and loose with your money. Don't do that. Risk management is key. I think the best thing, especially in the context of the stock market, the best thing you can do for your portfolio is that when you are investing, tell yourself, I may be making a mistake. Because I can tell you, for the best fund managers also, at least 20 to 30% will be completely a mistake. Mistake in the sense that the stock will not do anything like what you thought it would do. So which means you need to get out of it. So one thing is important, always have a stop loss. And let me just take a couple of minutes to explain this. So stop loss, it should be a trailing stop loss. And a lot of even Professional investors do not understand this concept. So what that means is that, let us say I mean, we use a more complex system, but let's say you have a 25% stop loss. So now if you buy something at 100, it doesn't mean that the stop loss forever is at 75 rupees. So you remain. On the other hand, never say that if the stock doubles or triples, I will exit, because that means you will miss out on the multi-baggers. So if you buy at 100, it goes to 150, it comes to 135, it goes to 200, goes to 180. You remain invested. It goes all the way up to 400. After going to 400, it comes down to 300. So now it's 25% down from the top. That's when you exit. That's when that stop loss gets triggered. Of course, it might happen that the stock starts to go up again, but on the average, this will save you money. And you forget that you did this. So sometimes you will buy that stock even at a higher price later. But, on the average, this discipline saves you money. So those are, some of the simple things you can do. Also, if you are buying stocks yourself and you say that these are my 5 criteria, that this much margin, that kind of growth, whatever, this kind of return on capital, then at least keep to that. Because many times I see people say this, but when you look at their actual portfolio, that's nowhere close to what they've said they are doing. So whatever is your system, it may not be as complex as the systems we use, but at least keep to that system.
Ma'am, now talking about risk management, diversification and diversifying globally is also a risk management strategy. And if somebody follows you, person would know that you are a strong proponent of investing abroad. So I wouldn't ask you why, because you've been talking about it for a long time. I just wanted to understand that if I'm an investor, right, and I've heard Devina ma'am talk about investing abroad, at what stage of my portfolio, so let's say I've just started out, I'm 25, I'm just doing a 10,000, 20,000 SIP. At what stage of my portfolio should I be investing outside India?
Yeah, so as soon as you can. So what you can do also is that now you can open a broking account. Right now, in most mutual funds, you can't really invest. So you can open even a international broking account, and for now, just buy some of the global index ETFs, for example. So not just US. That's the thing, that not just US, then either buy the whole group or something like that. And of course, for me, it's a cause that Indians do not invest abroad, and they should. So we have a global portfolio that starts at $10,000. It was 7.5 lakh rupees not so long ago. Now it's more like 9 lakh plus. But that is what that invests across all countries and all assets. Now this is something that a private bank will give to you for $1 million plus. But I wanted to make it accessible, so that's why we started at $10,000. So that's what I can do. Also, I will have a little bit of a cautionary thing on global, because I see a lot of organizations now offering global products simply because people are frustrated that India has not given returns. So let me go global, which is again a wrong way to look at it. This is not a 1 year thing. This is over a period of time, 30 to 40% of your portfolio should be global. But a lot of people offering global products have absolutely no expertise in that. So I would just caution on that, because I've seen fund managers who are on record themselves as not having any global investments even in their personal portfolio a year and a half ago, now positioning themselves as global experts. So be very cautious on that. We went global in 1999. We were not just the first Indian, we were the first Asian members of the London Stock Exchange, ex-Japan. Only the Japanese had gone west. So that was 99, and a year and a half later of the US Broker Dealer Association, also NASD. So, and we know how complex US companies or global companies are, because we've not been just covering US, we've been covering Europe and even the bigger companies in China and Japan since then. And those are very complex companies. The list of the companies itself keeps changing. In around 2000, when you said tech majors, it meant IBM, Dell, Motorola, Cisco. People forget Cisco at one time was the highest market cap company in the whole world. Now, when you say tech majors, these companies are still around, but they're not anywhere tech majors anymore. Only Microsoft was a major then and a major now, but the entire other list has stayed. So that's why it's not easy. People now just think that buying the 7 US stocks you've heard of and the 4 Chinese stocks you've heard of is global diversification, but that is not what it is. Not so be careful how you do the global diversification. That would be my other advice.
So my question is basically, how much of our portfolio should be in global stocks? Secondly, for a DIY investor, is it possible to start somewhere small? Let's say buy maybe 10% in US equities, Nasdaq or S&P 500 with through mutual funds which are available. Is that a possibility? Can somebody start that way?
No, so in that case, if you want to, as I said, if you buy an ETF, buy a global equity ETF rather than a US only ETF, because I think, US, the risks are building up. So the US is not the globe. I mean, if you remember, there were a lot of NASDAQ ETFs and fund of funds launched in 2021. And not in hindsight, but in real time, I have said that the US, and especially NASDAQ, has done so well in the last few years. The risks are building up. And sure enough, in 2022, NASDAQ was among the worst performing indexes in the whole world. I think it was number 40 out of 42. And then people came to me and said, should I sell? I said, now don't compound a bad buy with a bad sell, because the NASDAQ is down 40% from the time these mutual fund schemes had come out. And a major index down 40% is almost never a sell. A stock down 40%, 80% can still be a sell. But a major index almost never. So, I mean, again, it bounced back in 23. So, but the point is that US is not the world, and especially, risks have been building up. It's outperformed a long time. Also, the last 3 years, all the move has been a very narrow list of tech stocks. In fact, that's also getting narrower. It used to be Magnificent Seven, but last year the move was not even in all the 7. It was just in 3 or 4 of the 7. So the risks are building up. So if you want to buy a global index rather than only a US index, ETF fund.
I just wanted to understand on a personal front, you've been doing markets for over 3 decades now. Do you still get excited by markets the same way you used to? Or, that has evolved, the excitement has evolved in some other way?
Actually, I was never the person who was watching the ticker all day or had a business TV channel on all day. So, I mean, that was not my excitement. My excitement was really understanding industries, companies, and what is the value of that stock. So that part has not really diminished. I mean, that's still something that that still excites you.
So, ma'am, a lot is known about the stocks which you discovered many years back, right? Like HDFC, Amazon, and so on, right? But very little is known about the stocks that you've discovered over the past 5 to 7 years. Now, I just want to understand, what are some of the stocks that you discovered over the past 5 to 7 years which have turned out to be great bets for you?
Okay, see, first of all, those days we were on what was called the sell side. So we were servicing the fund manager. So you were actually bringing out reports. We used to bring out an average of 60 to 70 reports a month. So therefore the reports are there in the public domain on both sides. I mean, we were the first ones to call a peak that EduComp was good. There was something very shady there. But that apart, now we are managing funds. So we are not, we are not communicating on our stock picks anymore. Also, our systems have evolved to an artificial intelligence machine learning system, not as a black box, but as a tool. So what we call a human plus machine system. So that does a lot of the heavy lifting. And one of the things which we do is that now we are more data driven. And as I said, we are consciously, I mean, sometimes people ask us, which are your high conviction ideas? A big bank asks us that. And we actually sent a 3-page note on why by design we do not have high conviction ideas, because high conviction idea is what? You are married to a narrative. That's precisely what we are trying to guard against, because it's very seductive. Stories are very seductive to human beings. So we have made, we've had multi-baggers in the last 5 years, 6 years in our PMS. So in companies like Tata Elxsi or ITC or a whole bunch of the capital goods, industrial machinery companies, because we got into that sector as far back as October 2021. Whereas most other fund managers discovered it towards end of 23 when the stocks had already doubled, tripled, sometimes quadrupled. And the reason again was very simple because, as I said, human beings are creatures of the story. So that had been a dog sector from 2009 to 21. For 12 years, it had given practically no returns, 2% compounding. So people had stopped looking at it. Whereas because our systems looked at data and they kind of forced us to look at it. And that became a big winner. But we do not get married to the story. So I mean, Tata Elxsi, we made a lot of money on it, but we got out also. Or, chemical companies, I think again in 21, 22 we bought, but we didn't convince ourselves that that would last forever or they are the best companies in the world. So that's been the thing.
Ma'am, you also always say that the excitement for you in markets is more about learning, right? And you're there to learn, and it's a new learning every day. Now, just wanted to understand or want you to communicate to the viewers. What are the few things that you have learned in the past 1 year or so? What are the new things?
Which is not really to do with markets, but the fact that 1% can disrupt the world to this extent. I think last year all of us thought that TK is 4 years and we will live through it. But that you can dismantle a country and the globe's systems in this fashion, one didn't know. Of course, last few years, the big evolution has been, as I said, towards artificial intelligence, machine learning, not because, it's available or it is fashionable, but, something fundamental has changed in investing, which people have not realized. Fund managers are still making decisions the way they did in the 90s. The basic difference has been that in the 90s, the edge was an information edge. That you could sit with a company, and not just you, I'm talking even in the US, a big fund could sit in a room with a big company and get differential information. Now that's outlawed everywhere. Even analysts meet data has to be by law. The transcript has to be on the website. So now the skill set has shifted from getting information to being able to analyze information. And that's where the machines come in, because they can analyze more companies, more data per company, and do it without bias and without random noise. So the last few years, actually more than just the nitty-gritties of investing, it has been a learning of how many ways your own brain trips you up, how it is designed to trip you up. And that's been an area that fascinates me.
So the final part, the final question, the final segment, I want quick answers to some of the questions that I have. One investing rule that you think should never be broken.
Risk management.
Risk management. Okay. A popular belief today that you completely disagree with.
Buy and forget.
One habit that has helped you professionally.
Reading.
In this whole field of investing.
No doubt
Reading.
about it.
Okay.
Reading, yeah, where you cannot progress in life without feeding your mind.
One book that has changed you, maybe a non-finance book that has really helped you and changed you.
Daniel Kahneman's 2 books, Thinking Fast and Slow and Noise.
Also, ma'am, I've seen a lot of people say this. So do you also believe that to make money in stock market, you need to be a die-hard optimist?
No. This is again survivorship bias. You are talking that somebody who made money was an optimist. You are not looking at all the other people who were over-optimistic and went out of business.
Okay. One investing lesson that you think comes with age?
I think a lot of it, because a lot of it is there in the books, from asset allocation to, risk management and all that. But you start out still in life looking for the multi-baggers. So, yes. And also one other thing is that the definition of a mistake changes. That earlier you thought a bad outcome was the mistake. Now you evaluate differently because life is probability. So certain well-made decisions might have bad outcomes and certain bad decisions will have good outcomes. So,
ma'am, and I'm not talking about the past, but at this stage and at this point in time, if you were not doing anything related to markets, what would you be doing?
Probably teaching.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us and giving us time for this podcast. It was really wonderful talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.